Hello friends, this is Growl. I've spent almost the entirety of last week testing a new build for Mythic Plus that has worked very well for me, and I wanted to make a video about it to share my thoughts more thoroughly and explain how I felt the build has performed. I've been brainstorming a bit on the best way to make a video to cover everything, and I decided on two parts. The first part is going to be a bit more freeform, just me going over my thoughts on the build and how it's performed with some gameplay of a 27 temple we just did. In the second part, we'll go over some specifics to the build, what corruption and talent setup I use, and how to change your style of play. Before I begin, I want to talk about how I came to the idea of doing this and the original thought process behind the build. It's been apparent that Holy Paladins are starting to become more popular in the highest level of keys than Druids, and I think the main reason for that is their damage. They're able to put out significantly more damage than most Druids while still being able to keep their team alive. While it's easy to say that HPAL just does more damage, I think it's slightly untrue, and there's one major reason why Pallies are doing so much damage in keys, and that is their stat priority. The healing stat weights for Pally are actually very similar to Druid. They want a chunk of haste, but not necessarily to be stacking it. Mastery is their best healing stat, then followed by crit and verse. However, the way they've approached it is much different. Because you can power through any dangerous healing situation with wings, healing stat weights are almost irrelevant to Pallies, and they consider mastery as one of their worst stats because it doesn't contribute to their damage. Druids, however, think otherwise, getting a hefty amount of mastery to help with their healing. The Druid healing with high mastery is very powerful, considering it isn't cooldown based and you can heal through any situation. You don't need wings to get through a scary trash pull or a boss as long as you have the mana. The downside though is that the damage with this setup is quite lower. So I began theory crafting a build that would be able to heal without any mastery. My initial idea was a crit stacking build, using severes to greatly increase your stats, so that even if you weren't using the most efficient stats, you had so many of them to make the dungeon still healable, and that crit would be helping your damage as well. The problem that I ran into is that it just didn't seem that much better than the expedient with the damage corruption build, and it had the exact same problems. It had reasonably high damage, but the healing was a bit questionable to deal with tough dungeons like Waycrest or Temple. I was unsure if it would be good, but I did start work collecting the pieces for it anyway, since theorycraft is always different from practice. While this was going on, I began to notice the top world runs being dominated by several Chinese teams. Many of their players had one thing in common: they were stacking versatility, even the Holy Paladins. It initially didn't make a whole lot of sense to me, but the more I thought about it, the more I realized it might be the answer. Versatility generally has close to the same effect on damage and healing per point for druids as crit, so it doesn't make too much of a difference there. What did make a big difference is the survivability. Stacking verse greatly reduces the damage you're taking to the point where you can more or less ignore the damage from non-lethal mechanics simply by keeping life bloom on yourself and focusing healing your teammates. Yes, there is a slight healing drop because you don't have mastery, but the damage reduction from verse almost entirely makes up for it if you play smart and prioritize the right targets with your healing. You're able to maintain very high damage during downtime, and you can still put out the required healing with the added benefit of being extra tanky. I saw everyone verse stacking also running almost 60 corruption, so the added survivability might even give you the ability to run an extra 20 corruption over the normal druid build. I started immediately collecting echoes and items to build the verse stack set so I could begin testing. That brings us to today. I've been playing it for 7 days straight, non-stop in some of the highest keys, and I've come to the conclusion that I think it is the best build for high keys, and I'm probably going to be running it for the remainder of the expansion. I'll go over what I think are the pros and cons of the build, and answer some questions about common misconceptions about it. First, the benefits. The most important, obvious benefit is an increase in damage, specifically in the harder keys. Previously, it was fine to just run a heavy haste and crit build with some damage corruption in keys that didn't require much healing, like Freehold or Siege. But the problem is you couldn't easily bring this build into some of the higher keys in harder dungeons. The verse build can have high damage output even in the harder dungeons, and I saw an immediate damage increase across the board in dungeons from a normal higher mastery setup. Second is the survivability. This was a sleeper benefit, but it's actually a pretty big deal for me. The damage you take by everything is decreased by around 30% with food buffs and conflict stacks, so I'm not nearly as vulnerable to dying as I was before. I've said it before, the most important quality of a good healer is not dying, and running this build has honestly saved me in a ton of keys and allowed me to focus more attention on keeping my allies alive. Lastly is mana and spell efficiency. Normally, with a mastery heavy build, you're going to have a few hots set up if you want to do big healing. And with the verse build, you can immediately top a teammate with 2 spells to go back to doing damage. This was something I noticed right away when running the build. In the same polls that I was starved for mana a week or two ago, I was now able to stay at nearly full mana for the entire time. It isn't necessarily true on patchwork healing fights like Galvast or Lord and Lady Waycrest. However, in normal dungeon situations where you're weaving between tank healing, DPS, and a bit of topping other players up, the efficiency per initial spellcast is definitely noticeable. Now the downsides. There's really only one major downside, and that's your healing is slightly reduced. While reduced isn't a perfect word, it's more that your healing is finite. Your initial healing is actually stronger. However, if you need to heal for an extended period of time, your healing will be less than that of a mastery build. Encounters like Zool, with massive single target HPS requirements, can be a bit more challenging. However, at the time of making this video, I haven't run into a situation where I felt my healing wasn't sufficient, including a 27 Temple and Waycrest keys. So what were the official results? Well, it was incredibly strong. It took a bit of getting used to, but after just one day, I was already certain that I was going to be using this build in at least some dungeons. I was initially worried that it wouldn't work in some places, but I challenged myself to bring it everywhere, and honestly, it didn't let me down once. It felt like an amazing middle ground build between everything needed in M+. It had solid damage and healing with insane levels of survivability. You could min-max each one of these areas and improve them slightly more, however, you usually end up sacrificing too much in one of the other areas to do it. Compared to a strictly expedient and masterful build, it's definitely less healing, but it is a 50% or more increase on overall damage. Compared to an expedient or gushing Mindflay build, I believe it is just as much damage with even stronger healing and more importantly, more survivability. Previously, I recommended some mix of Twisted Appendage and Gushing with Expedient, but now I think for an all-around or high damage setup, you should want to just verse stack. Next, I want to go over 2 common misconceptions I've seen when asked about the build, so you can understand exactly what's going on with it. First, the verse build doesn't unlock some sort of secret new level of healing or damage. Verse is a fairly average stat, and it isn't going to do the most amount of healing or the most amount of damage. But what it is to me is the best middle ground between the healing and damage, as well as a ton of bonus survivability. You stack Verse because it contributes to everything, and I've said it before, but Mythic plus healing is not necessarily about throughput, but being able to handle all the situations thrown at you. Second is that the build is only in high keys because of survival. While the build definitely goes up in value the higher you go, I definitely don't think the build is only for survival or somehow doesn't work well in low keys. If the build can heal 27 keys, it can absolutely heal 17 keys easily. If you want to have a strictly healing focused build, you may be better off stacking just Expedient and Masterful. But for a more well-rounded build that can deal more damage and survive higher keys, I think verse stacking is the optimal path. Lastly, I want to go over some questions I've been getting a lot about the build. First is, if you've been working on or already have a Haste Mastery build, should you just scrap it and start building a verse set? Honestly, I don't think so. Haste Mastery is still very strong, and there are people timing high keys all the way up to the very top, and have been for the entire expansion. Nothing has changed. If you already have a good equipment setup for Haste Mastery, use it. Don't feel like you're somehow using an item set that isn't good. It's still definitely good. There's also nothing wrong with Expedient with some damage corruption like Gushing or Mindflay. That setup is still good too. I definitely think the verse set, though, is something you should have in mind after you have your main item set completed. Next, if you're just starting off gearing, should you gear Haste Mastery or verse stack? This is where I've had the most disagreements with some of the other community members, but I think I'm still going to stick to my guns. I play games with the idea that someday I might be at the top, and I think you should too. I wouldn't use items or talents or strategies that I didn't think was going to work best at the highest level. If I was starting off fresh, I probably would just stack Verse the whole way. The Verse build is nice because there really isn't a lot of decision making to it. You can run it in every dungeon with a little bit less experience and be a lot more successful, I think, than the Haste Mastery set. Verse gives you added survivability that helps when you're newer to pushing keys, and it gives you a nice mix of damage and healing so you don't have to worry about exactly what you need for this specific dungeon. That wraps up most of what I wanted to talk to in part 1. In part 2, I'm going to go over some of the specifics of the build if you're trying to set it up yourself and play it in keys. Thanks for watching. If you enjoyed this video, I'd appreciate it if you liked and subscribed to my channel. I'll be continuing to release high-level Mythic Plus healer content for BFA and into Shadowlands. Happy keying!